Last week, I know it was a little overwhelming as we started our study of the law, or the law of Moses, with an extensive expose on Exodus 21:1. Now, you're going to be relieved to know that this week isn't going to be nearly so intense. However, it's my hope that you gain some understanding of why Hebrews have, since Moses, sought so diligently to follow God's instructions to them, and that we need to be very careful how we characterize the rules of living that God set out before mankind prior to the advent of Christ. We saw last week that what Hebrews and Christians alike term the law, God refers to as his mishpat. And mishpat does not mean law. It means justice. Further, we saw that mishpat, when referring to God's mishpat, is speaking of his overall system of justice. Today, we are about to begin looking at the specifics of God's justice system, God's detailed standard of right living, individual rules and regulations that were set down in the Mosaic covenant. To put an even finer point on it, what we are getting ready to study is the development of the gospel. Quite literally, what we're going to begin to look at is the gospel, Act 1. Now let's quickly review a few things from last week. Man's righteousness and God's righteousness, our tzedek and his tzedek, are not the same. Actually, that shouldn't be difficult to swallow because God is not a man. Mankind can't develop or work to achieve the type of righteousness God has. God's righteousness, even if we're not able to fully grasp all that it entails, is primarily about the salvation of mankind. God's righteousness, his tzedek, refers to his saving will, his saving purposes and goals, and all that happens at his direction to create a people that are set apart for himself. We call the people who are part of that group the saved people. Now, accordingly, humanity is the object of God's saving will, which is God's righteousness. Man's righteousness is achieved when a human being has accepted God's saving will, Jehovah's saving plan for his own life. And since the coming of Christ, a righteous man is defined as one who is a believer in Yeshua, who is the Christ, who is the Messiah. Third, the gospel is generally defined as, it's defined this way among theologians, the revealed word of God's plan of salvation for all mankind. The revealed word of God's plan of salvation for all mankind. That's the gospel. That is, the gospel is simply the name or the title we've given to a body of information in the Bible that makes known God's incredible plan of salvation for us and our need for it. Fourth, but over the centuries, it seems, the term gospel has been so narrowed down by so many theologians and by the institutional church as to make the term simply refer to the story and purpose of Christ, his birth, his life, his death, resurrection, and nothing else. That's completely wrong, and it's not scriptural. Christ certainly is the center point, the focus, the cornerstone of God's plan of salvation. But as we saw last week, the first awareness of this plan of salvation by man was given to Abraham. And it had to happen in the salvation process before Yeshua came. Much has to happen before he comes again. And all of it, not just the New Testament part, forms the gospel. In reality, the Old Testament is where the gospel is found. The New Testament simply identifies who the Messiah of the Old Testament gospel is. And it gives us some instruction on what this means for us now that the Messiah has come. We need to remember that Jesus and all the apostles taught the Gospels using only the Old Testament. There was no such thing as a New Testament until decades after their death. And finally, as we begin to look at the laws in the covenant of Moses, let's remember that the Israelites intended with fierce dedication to be obedient to God's instructions and principles. The Hebrews had no developed sense of an afterlife in those ancient times, or of living an eternal life with God. That did not exist. In fact, they thought that life ended at the grave, Sheol, and that death permanently separated them from the Almighty. So in their minds, their physical lives were their only time to show their gratitude to the Lord for His grace towards them at making them a member of the set-apart people. The Hebrews may not have fully grasped what true salvation is or what the full purpose of the law was, but for Christians today to accuse Hebrews of legalism simply for doing what God commands them, that's nonsense. Christians have forgotten that in addition to our saving relationship with Jehovah God, we also have the duty to be obedient to Him. If you have any doubt about that fact, read the book of James, Jesus' brother. Though obedience is not a condition of our attaining, or in most cases, even keeping our salvation, nor should obedience take the focus off of our relationship with God, it's absolutely the required and expected response. Obedience to God's system of justice is not legalism unless we misuse it as a system of self-justification. Let's read Exodus chapter 21 together. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, it is on page 83. Exodus chapter 21. These are the rulings you are to present to them. If you purchase a Hebrew slave, he is to work 6 years, but in the seventh he is to be given his freedom without having to pay anything. If he came single, he is to leave single. If he was married when he came, his wife is to go with him when he leaves. But if the master gave him a wife, and she bore him sons or daughters, then the wife and the children will belong to her master. He will leave by himself. Nevertheless, if the slave declares, I love my master and my wife and my children, so I don't want to go free, then the master is to bring him before God. And there at the door or doorpost, his master is to pierce his ear with an awl, and the man will be his slave for life. If a man sells his daughter as a slave, she is not to go free like the men slaves. If her master married her, but decides she no longer pleases him, then he is to allow her to be redeemed. He is not allowed to sell her to a foreign people because he has treated her unfairly. If he has her marry his son, then he is to treat her like a daughter. If he marries another wife, he's not to reduce her food, clothing, or marital rights. If he fails to provide her with any of these three things, she is to be given her freedom without having to pay anything. Whoever attacks a person and causes his death must be put to death. If it was not premeditated but an act of God, then I will designate for you a place to which he can flee. But if someone willfully kills another after deliberate planning, you are to take him even from my altar and put him to death. Whoever attacks his father or mother must be put to death. Whoever kidnaps someone must be put to death, regardless of whether he has already sold him or the person is found still in his possession. Whoever curses his father or mother must be put to death. If two people fight, one hits the other with a stone or with his fist, and the injured party doesn't die, but is confined to his bed, then if he recovers enough to be able to walk around outside, even with a cane, the attacker will be free of his liability, except to compensate him for his loss of time and take responsibility for his care until his recovery is complete. If a person beats his male or female slave with a stick so severely that he dies, he's to be punished. Except that if the slave lives for a day or two, he is not to be punished, since the slave is his property. If people are fighting with each other and happen to hurt a pregnant woman so badly that her unborn child dies, then even if no other harm follows, he must be fined. He must pay the amount set by the woman's husband and confirmed by judges. But if any harm follows, then you are to give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. If a person hits his male or female slave's eye and destroys it, he must let him go free in compensation for his eye. If he knocks out his male or female slave's tooth, he must let him go free in compensation for his tooth. If an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox is to be stoned and its flesh not eaten, but the owner of the ox will have no further liability. However, if the ox was in the habit of goring in the past, and the owner was warned but did not confine it so that it ended up killing a man or a woman, then the ox is to be stoned and the owner too is to be put to death. However, a ransom may be imposed upon him, and the death penalty may be commuted if he pays the amount imposed. If the ox gores a son or a daughter, the same rule applies. If the ox gores a male or female slave, its owner must give their master 12 ounces of silver, and the ox is to be stoned to death. If someone removes the cover from a cistern or digs one, and he fails to cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls in, the owner of the cistern must make good the loss by compensating the animal's owner, but the dead animal will be his. If one person's ox hurts another's so that it dies, they are to sell the live ox and divide the revenue from the sale, and they are also to divide the dead animal. But if it is known that the ox was in the habit of goring in the past, and the owner did not confine it, he must pay for the ox, but the dead animal will be his. If someone steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters or sells it, he is to pay 5 oxen for an ox, 4 sheep for a sheep. Now, what we've read here is the Lord ordering a new Hebrew society. What we need to also recognize, and it'll become obvious as we move through Exodus and then Leviticus, that while there are many rules and ordinances that are contained within these passages, this is hardly a comprehensive legal code, such as the Code of Hammurabi. In other words, not every area of life is covered in detail by these ordinances. Marriage, commerce, inheritance, how property is transferred, are all either barely touched on or not even mentioned directly at all. Rather, most of these so-called laws were examples that tended to amend previous practices of the Hebrews, or in some cases they were new concepts altogether. No matter their purpose, they were always extensions, and boy, this is the important part. They were always extensions of the first 10 laws that we call the 10 Commandments. Always. Therefore, Israel's leaders necessarily devised practices and rules that covered both areas, covered areas of the law, but it did not address or fill in gaps or very broad principles. These practices and rules came to be called oral law, oral tradition, later on just tradition. Now, while this chapter begins with a practice that we find aberrant in our nation. It was obviously permitted in ancient days. Slavery. One human being owning another is not God's ideal. The Bible does not endorse slavery. Yet, for his own good reasons, Jehovah has permitted the man-made economic system of slavery to exist. But here, God sets out its boundaries. And as we go through the next 3 chapters, there's going to be many biblical practices that seem primitive, harsh, even barbarian, or just plain unfair to our minds. And while we might have occasion to discuss some of these individual laws, what I intend to do is to look at these rules and regulations more from a standpoint of the God principle that they embody. Because as believers, it's not necessarily our duty to follow ancient Hebrew cultural traditions and rituals that were developed by sages and rabbis over the centuries. But it is our duty to follow the principles behind those traditions and rituals, and to obey plainly written Torah commandments that seem to seamlessly cross technology, time, and culture. Let's begin by noting that using the 10 words, the 10 commandments, as the foundation, the first group of laws given to Israel are contained in Exodus 21, 22, and 23, and they are divided into 2 fundamental categories. First, the civil and social position of all Israelites as they relate to one another. That is, human-to-human interaction. And second, Israel's position as they relate to God. So category 1, which is delineated in Exodus 21:2 through Exodus 23:12, has to do with how the Israelites are to deal justly, to do mishpat, with their fellow man. Category 2, which starts in Exodus 23 and verses 13 through 19, speaks of how Israelites are to deal righteously with God. And what we should take immediate notice of is that God has just turned the common world social ladder upside down. Unlike any civil and social system ever devised by man, the one given to Israel by Jehovah begins by its concern for dealing fairly with those who are the lowest on the social scale, slaves. God lays down rights for slaves, male and female, people who are totally dependent upon the mercy of their masters. Slaves were but property in the ancient world, tools, beasts of burden, as it still is in many places on earth today. But by ordaining sacred personal rights upon this social class, God changed the very dynamic by which slavery could even exist. Hebrew slaves were given the status of people, not possessions, not animals. Underline the word Hebrew, because that's the key. We must understand that Hebrews held 2 classes of slaves, Hebrews and foreigners, Gentiles. These rules are made for Hebrew slaves. They do not apply to foreign slaves that Hebrews might own. However, later on in the Torah, instructions will be issued by God that foreign slaves who wish to give up their Gentile, tribal, or national identities and become Israelites should be allowed to do so. The act of changing loyalties did not set them free, but it did make them Hebrew slaves and give them a bill of rights that they did not have as foreigners. Even more, Jehovah makes it clear that any foreigner who joins Israel and becomes a Hebrew by choice is not to be considered as a second-class citizen. Therefore, if a foreign slave owned by a Hebrew declares his desire to join Israel, and he goes on to become a Hebrew, he becomes equal in status and rights to a natural-born Hebrew slave. Once that naturalized slave becomes free, then he is a Hebrew freedman with rights and status equal to a natural-born Hebrew freedman. Now, by the way, notice Exodus 21, verse 6. This is where a male slave gets his ear pierced, and although it doesn't say it, he also has a ring of some sort put into it. This is an indication that this man, as head of his family, has voluntarily committed himself and his family to lifelong servitude to his earthly master. The master of this slave family is not obligated to free them after 6 years, which was the Hebrew law. Although in an act of mercy, a master could free a slave whenever he chose. Now, verses 7 through 11 deals with a man who sells his daughter to be used as a house servant, but with the idea that if she pleases her master, he'll marry her. Now, she's not to be considered among the slave class even during her time as a handmaiden. The first thing we should note is that this must have been a pretty common occurrence to be so directly and specifically addressed by God. Now, the girl could well become a concubine of her master. That is, she's not a wife, but she holds a status similar to a wife. The main difference is there would not have been a ketubah, a marriage contract. So there was no legal betrothal. She would have had no property rights. A Hebrew would not sell his own wife, but he would sell a handmaid, on occasion a concubine. But Yehovah says that under no circumstances may the master sell this woman to anybody outside of the tribes of Israel. And if he chooses to make her a concubine or a wife, regardless of the fact that he had quite literally acquired her through purchase, he cannot treat her poorly should he marry another woman. Of course, we're talking about polygamy here. And his penalty for wronging this woman is she gets her freedom. Now, while it may not seem so to us in this cultural setting, what is really happening here is that God is making it clear that in the paternalistic society of Israel, typical of the ancient world, women have rights. They have value to God. They are to be treated fairly and with consideration among his set-apart people. Now, the next thing to be addressed after slaves and women's rights is the sanctity of life. Life is so important to God that he lists the crimes of man against man, for which God orders the destruction of the offender, in order that the criminal might not harm another innocent person or degrade Israel's society in general. Part of this list of capital crimes we might expect. Other parts are kind of a surprise. Part of this list of capital crimes sets the same level of seriousness, premeditated murder, attacking and harming, not necessarily killing, one's parents, kidnapping, whether the victim is harmed or not, and even cursing one's parents. That is, in his holy eyes, all of these things deserve the death penalty. God offers no mercy for these perpetrators. He offers no possibility of rehabilitation. This is capital punishment, pure, swift, non-retractable. Now, just so we understand what it means to curse your parents, there are several words used for curse or cursing in Hebrew. They are quite specific in their meaning and range from meaning swearing an oath against someone to being menacing and threatening. Now understand, I'm talking about biblical Hebrew, not necessarily modern conversational Hebrew. So it's two different things. The word used for curse in the instance of Exodus 21:17 is kalal. And it is used in the sense of a son insulting, shaming, being an embarrassment to his parents because he's of no account. This would include not performing his sonly duty of caring for them if they need his help. So for a son who humiliates his parents by his behavior or shows his parents disrespect, or he's simply a deadbeat, a bum, Jehovah says put him to death. Whoa. And yet, God sees this as actually guarding life. Because the people who do these shameful things steal life from those who God sees as innocent and upright. We also see the principle of intention validated by God. That is, the intention of one's heart has everything to do with the consequences of one's actions, at least in God's eyes. For instance, if someone unintentionally kills another person, then the perpetrator is given a place to escape, and no one is allowed to violate that place to apprehend him. This is the principle of sanctuary. But premeditated murder, the intention to kill, offers no such sanctuary. And the perpetrator can be arrested, captured in the holiest of places. Even if he's in the midst of sacrificing at the altar of God, a murderer can be arrested. Now, these last few verses, and a couple of the following, answered the question that was raised when we studied the sixth commandment, the sixth word, thou shalt not murder. And the question was, what is just versus unjust killing of a human? So next in verses 18 through 27, ordinances are set down to deal with protection of life, dealing first with bodily harm to a man, then dealing with harming animals. Now, this reinforces the love and concern that God has for all of his living creatures. So when one of his animals, in their innocence, has to be sacrificed to atone for a transgression committed by a human against God, it grieves our Lord for this animal to have to forfeit its life. All those millions upon millions of animal sacrifices that would follow, century after century, this was no small thing to God. Each and every one of those sacrificed lives mattered to him. Now, what I hope you noticed is that another key principle God is showing us in these verses is recompense. That is, each offense is to have an equal and fair compensation as part of the consequence. God views compensation as better than incarceration for the offender. Compensation makes the perpetrator, compensation from the perpetrator makes some progress towards making the victim whole. It even allows the offender to go on with their life while being taught a lesson. Imprisonment simply punishes the offender, and the victim's only satisfaction is knowing the perpetrator's being punished. That's all you get out of it. Notice how in verse 18, that if two men get into a fight and one seriously injures the other one, then the one who did the harm is obligated to care for the other. He's obligated to bear all of that other's expenses, make up any of his lost wages. But there's no further obligation, because the fight was a mutual attempt to harm one another in the first place. In our modern legal system, we would call this the principle of shared liability, for you lawyers out there. Now notice also that verse 20 deals with the matter of a master beating his slave to death. And again, due to God's value of life, the slave master is to be punished. The dead slave's owner can be killed. That's the meaning of the term avenged that's here. But if the slave lives a couple of days before he dies, then because the slave owner would be simply throwing his money down the drain by killing this paid-for slave, there's to be no punishment. The idea here is that if a slave dies immediately from the punishment the master is inflicting, there's no doubt the master intended to kill him. This is murder. But if the master punishes his slave and the slave is gravely harmed as a result, but he doesn't die immediately, lives a few days, but then the slave dies, there's no doubt as to the master's intent to kill. There's even doubt as to whether the punishment that the master inflicted is the actual cause of the slave's death. Therefore, the loss of the valuable slave is considered sufficient punishment in itself. No further consequence to the master is ordered. Next is what happens if a pregnant woman loses her unborn child as a result of her being harmed. And in verses 23 through 25, we get the statement which just about every literate person, believer or pagan, on the face of our planet likes to quote. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. It's too bad people don't read the several paragraphs before and after that statement, because it would be much better understood if they did. The God principle behind the eye for an eye formula set forth is this. The consequences of accidental or unlawful actions require equity and fairness. If someone knocks out somebody's tooth, equitable compensation is to be rendered. This in no way requires or endorses the offender's tooth to be knocked out. Or if an eye is damaged, the offender's eye is not to be damaged in return, but rather there's to be proper compensation in proportion to the extent of the harm that was inflicted. What's happening in verses 23 through 25 is that God is saying, in essence, look, it would be a never-ending law code if I took every possible way and circumstance that one person could harm another person and give a prescribed verdict containing a precise amount of compensation for it. It's impossible. Therefore, here is the principle that you're to use when you're deciding upon compensation. And of course, this principle is tied to the entire context of Exodus chapter 21, whereby God gives only a few reasons for a death sentence, and none whereby a person is mutilated as punishment, such as gouging out an eye. Again, the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, bruise for a bruise idea is fair and equitable compensation. One should get more compensation for losing a tooth than for merely being bruised. Even greater compensation should be paid for losing an eye than for losing a tooth, because the effect is far greater on the victim. Too much compensation, well, that's as wrong as too little. Life for a life does not necessarily mean the death penalty. It can often mean a very high amount of compensation, probably to be accompanied with a harsh punishment. God lists very clearly the capital offenses. All punishments are to revolve around fair and just compensation. Notice the all-important context of this eye for an eye principle. It has to do with the circumstance of accidental homicide, manslaughter. It speaks of two men fighting and then an innocent bystander, a pregnant woman, somehow winds up getting knocked down. First is what happens if her unborn baby dies. But then, in verse 23, it says, but if other damage ensues, then the principle shall be life for life, eye for eye, so on and so forth. It is key to understand that the death penalty for the taking of human life is, according to the Torah, only to be exacted when the killing is intentional. The scenario offered here is obviously an unintended killing. Therefore, this absolutely is not suggesting the death penalty when it says life for life. Now, one more comment. I mentioned that mutilation is not a permitted punishment. Rather, it was just not part of the Hebrew justice system. Now, this is not to say it didn't happen, or that tyrannical Hebrew kings and princes didn't capriciously apply mutilation from time to time. But it was not authorized by God, and was generally seen by the common people as evil and wicked. Now, Islam loves to claim that Christians, Hebrews, and Muslims all share the same God. And therefore, Islam is simply scrupulously following Allah's instructions when they mutilate offenders of Islamic Sharia law. That is, they cut off hands, fingers, feet, gouge out eyes, cut out tongues, so on and so forth. Actually, the Bible teaches against such things. But the Quran, the Muslim holy book, commands mutilations. This is just further proof that Allah is in no way just another culture's name for Jehovah our God. No way. Or that the Muslim Quran is based on the same principles as the Bible. It's not. Enough said for now. Verse 26 once again deals with slaves. And the price for harsh treatment of a slave, even simply knocking out a slave's tooth, is immediate freedom for that slave, male or female. Verse 28 begins to deal with harm that animals might cause. And we get God's view of justice in this regard. An animal that kills a human must die. God makes it clear that humans are above animals in inherent worth to him, which is apparently news to several animal rights groups, by the way. But the animal's owner is not to be blamed or punished unless that owner knew his animal had a propensity to harm humans. If the negligent owner's animal kills someone, then the owner must be put to death for such gross negligence, along with the animal itself, of course. The idea is that the owner is guilty of gross disregard of the life of others, and therefore he is fully responsible and he will pay the ultimate penalty. However, there is a provision that depending on the circumstance, if the animal's negligent owner or kin pays a ransom to the family of the dead person, then that can suffice as punishment since this was not technically murder. The implication is not only as regards the exact circumstances of the situation, but that it is the judgment of the aggrieved family whether they'll even accept money as compensation or the offender's life as punishment. Murder can never be allowed to pass without the execution of the murderer. However, strictly speaking, wanton negligence isn't quite the same thing as murder. So a loophole, a very expensive out, is added. Now conversely, if someone's negligence causes the death of another's animal, then the one who caused the problem is liable to pay compensation. The example given here is leaving the cover off of a water well. And an animal falls in. He dies. Interestingly, the negligent person gets to keep the dead animal if he pays out compensation for its death. He's essentially bought the animal. Now, the last verse covers what happens if someone steals from somebody. Again, the idea is compensation, but not at an equitable level. Instead, it's to be rendered at a punitive level. Here again, intention is at work. Stealing does not occur accidentally, despite what your children tell you. Didn't mean to take your wallet, Dad. However, in America, if you listen to some of our more liberal politicians and lawyers, I guess that happens all the time. Anyway, someone who causes loss, harm, or death to another person and does so intentionally is dealt with much more harshly than if it was unintentional or even negligent. Let's move on to chapter 22. Exodus chapter 22, page 84 if you have a complete Jewish Bible. Follow along, please. If a thief caught in the act of breaking in is beaten to death, it is not murder, unless it happens after sunrise, in which case it is murder. A thief must make restitution, so if he has nothing, he himself is to be sold to make good the loss from the theft. If what he stole is found alive in his possession, he's to pay double, no matter whether it's an ox, a donkey, or a sheep. If a person causes a field or a vineyard to be grazed over and lets his animal loose to graze in somebody else's field, he is to make restitution from the best produce of his own field and vineyard. If a fire is started and it spreads to thorns so that stacked grain, standing grain, or a field is destroyed, the person who lit it must make restitution. If a person entrusts a neighbor with money or goods and they are stolen from the trustee's house, then if the thief is found, he must pay double. But if the thief is not found, the trustee must state before God he did not take the person's goods himself. In every case of dispute over ownership, whether of an ox, a donkey, a sheep, clothing, any missing property, where one person says, "This is mine," both parties are to come before God, and the one whom God condemns must pay the other one double. If a person trusts a neighbor to look after a donkey, ox, sheep, or any other animal, and it dies, or it's injured, or it's driven away unseen, then the neighbor's oath before Adonai that he has not taken the goods will settle the matter between them. The owner is to accept it without the neighbor making restitution. But if it was stolen from the neighbor, he must make restitution to the owner. If it was torn to pieces by an animal, the neighbor must bring it in as evidence, and then he doesn't need to make good the loss. If someone borrows something from his neighbor and it gets injured or it dies, with the owner not present, he must make restitution. If the owner was present, he need not make good the loss. If the owner hired it out, the loss is covered by the hiring fee. If a man seduces a virgin who is not engaged to be married and sleeps with her, he must pay the bride price for her to be his wife. But if her father refuses to give her to him, he must pay a sum equal to the bride price for virgins. You are not to permit a sorceress to live. Whoever has sexual relations with an animal must be put to death. Anyone who sacrifices to any god other than Adonai alone is to be completely destroyed. You must neither wrong nor oppress a foreigner living among you, for you yourselves were foreigners in the land of Egypt. You are not to abuse any widow or orphan. If you abuse them in any way and they cry to me, I will certainly heed their cry. My anger will burn and I will kill you with the sword. Your own wives will be widows, your own children fatherless. If you loan money to one of my people who is poor, you are not to deal with him as you would a creditor. You are not to charge him interest. If you take your neighbor's coat as collateral, you are to restore it to him by sundown, because it is his only garment. He needs it to wrap his body. What else does he have in which to sleep? And if he cries out to me, I'll listen, because I am compassionate. You are not to curse God. You are not to curse a leader of your people. You are not to delay offering from your harvest of grain, olive oil, or wine. The firstborn of your sons you are to give to me. You are to do the same with your oxen and your sheep. It is to stay with its mother for 7 days, and on the 8th day you are to give it to me. You are to be my specially separated people. Therefore, you are not to eat any flesh torn by wild animals in the countryside. Rather, throw it out for the dogs. Now, depending on your version, the first verse of Exodus chapter 22 is sometimes the last verse of Exodus chapter 21. In reality, this never should have been used as a chapter division, because it's just the same continuing thought and context and scene. In any case, We continue here with the crime of thievery. And the idea surrounding these ordinances against thievery is the protection of property. Now, personally, I really wish the United States would adopt the Mosaic Covenant's way of dealing with a thief. It would be far more effective. Notice how if you catch a thief in the act during darkness, you can legally kill him on the spot. However, if it's in daylight, you can't. Practical reason is, being in the dark, you can't evaluate the danger of the overall situation very well. Whether it's one thief or more, whether he has a weapon or not, whether this person may be a known murderer that's on the loose, you just don't know. In daytime, you can more easily tell. So if you can reasonably see that the only danger is of losing property, but not being harmed, then to kill that thief is murder. The part I like best, though, is the restitution aspect. That a thief has to replace what he's taken and has to, most times, offer it back to you several times over. And if he refuses or will not follow through with his promise to do so, then he can be taken into custody, sold off as a slave, with the money given to the person who was robbed. Now, I say that tongue-in-cheek. I'm not advocating the return of slavery, okay? Although I suspect such a system would significantly slow to a trickle the epidemic of robberies and burglaries throughout the Western world. Now, interesting, isn't it, that imprisonment was just not part of God's justice system. Now, certainly one could understand how having a prison out in the wilderness would be difficult to impossible. But this concept of recompense instead of incarceration continued right on through the time of Christ, when prisons were standard in most societies. The idea of prison was aberrant to Jews. It was the Gentile way of dealing with crime and punishment. Not that Jews didn't eventually adopt the practice to a degree, but since it was not part of God's justice system, it was never widely used until modern times. Now, I think it's instructional that the use of prisons has never seemed to stem the tide of crime to any degree at all. In fact, we are all too aware that people who've been in prison today commit most of the crimes as soon as they get out. Even our feeble attempt to rehabilitate prisoners via schooling and knowledge during their time of imprisonment has had very little success. That's because it's not the way Jehovah created the universe to operate. God's system of justice was designed to rehabilitate the criminal by means of his compensating his victim. There's a real price to pay. The crime was simply not worth what it cost him when he was caught. See, it's always important in reading Scripture to see the order of things. It usually gives us God's sense of priorities. So first, as regards theft among herders, we get rules about pilfering animals. Next, we see God's justice as concerned damage to fields, and then the formula that an animal life carries higher value to God than plant life. And as of the time Israel was given these laws, they were still in the wilderness. They were not farmers, but they were herdsmen. In time, they would need laws concerning agriculture, because once they settled in the land of Canaan, many would become farmers. Next, in verse 6, comes instruction regarding what has been given to others for safekeeping. What happens if those items are stolen? Now, up to this point, you might have noticed that there has been this interesting if-then structure as Jehovah has taught his law. If this happens, if someone does this, then this is the consequence. The idea here is that these things are going to arise within the body of God's set-apart people. They're going to have to be dealt with as part of ordinary, everyday life and society. It also sets up the dynamic of action versus consequence. If you do this, then this is what's going to happen to you. The point is that these are practical matters that are being dealt with, not theoretical possibilities. Further, societal law codes were normal for that day. The law of Moses wasn't the first. The Israelites fully expected to have a law code. And these law codes were all quite similar, even if they didn't agree on every point. It's a little bit like in modern Western society. Europe and North America share similar philosophies of justice. We have courts of law, legal experts as representatives of defendants, the view that generally a person cannot be physically harmed for an offense that only involves property. Sanctioned mutilation of criminals is not allowed. The death penalty is withheld except in the most horrific of circumstances when loss of life is involved. What constituted a crime was generally the same for Israel as it was in all other Middle Eastern societies. And more often than not, the punishments were quite similar. However, Israel's law involved far more mercy and compassion. And where it was the norm in other societies to do physical harm to a common thief, in Israel it's forbidden. Israel's law insisted on establishing that humans are more important than animals. Animals are more important than other kinds of property. Well, now we begin to encounter some laws that have an entirely different character. Beginning in either verse 17 or 18, depends on your Bible version, there starts a series of regulations stating what must never occur within the family of God. That is, these acts are so out of character for one who would suppose him or herself to be part of God's set-apart people, that most of these laws involve the immediate destruction of that person. These are matters of morality and conscience rather than crimes that are committed against a fellow man. Notice that the previous laws took circumstances and intent into consideration when deciding what, if any, consequence ought to result. In these things listed from Exodus 22, 17 to 30, except for perhaps about the verses about loaning money, intent and circumstance plays almost no role. So in verse 17, the matter of sorcery is addressed. No magic of any kind is to be practiced among God's people. Therefore, a witch, a female sorcerer, is to be summarily exterminated when found out. Sorcery, by definition, is the invoking of the names of gods and demons to do your bidding. And since monotheism recognized but one God, it rejects any catering to evil spirits, this was a most serious offense against the Lord. It was also dangerous because sorcery was virtually universal in ancient times, so people were easily drawn to it and deceived by a sorcerer. That magic was outlawed in Israel was known far and wide in the region. And you know what? It was thought to be most peculiar. In fact, in the famous episode of Balaam and King Balak that you can find in the book of Numbers, we're going to find this statement from Balaam when he discovers this strange prohibition against occult practices among the Hebrews. He says, "Lo, there is no augury in Jacob, no divining in Israel." He knows this. Well, the next prohibition is against the practice of bestiality. This horrible perversion of having a human have sexual intercourse with an animal is not some fanciful product of a vivid imagination. It was widespread throughout the inhabitants of Canaan. Even the Hittites found this practice an abomination, and we have the records of their law codes demanding the death of anyone who would think to do such a thing. In verse 19, the instruction that Israel is never to worship other gods is fleshed out a little bit, in that Israel is never to sacrifice to another god. Sacrifice is at the heart of idolatry. So to sacrifice upon the altar of a heathen god, it is here defined as deserving of complete annihilation of the one who commits that apostasy. What is informative, at least it is to me, is the need the Lord and Moses seem to have to even say not to sacrifice to a pagan god after it's already been made clear one is not to worship or acknowledge other gods. What's the difference between worshiping other gods and sacrificing to other gods? Nothing, unless you're looking for a reason to do what you want to do. You're looking for a loophole. The reason the issue is discussed in this way is quite simple. The Israelites were always looking for technicalities and exceptions to the rule against idolatry. Some Israelites would sacrifice to a pagan god and say, well, I'm not worshiping that god. I'm just offering an animal sacrifice. That's not quite the same thing. I just want them to do what I want or not do what I don't want. See, they liked their idolatry. They wanted to keep their idolatry. They wanted to operate like the rest of the world. They didn't want to be different. The Bible is loaded with examples of Israel constantly falling back into idol worship, and practically every time one of God's prophets called them on the carpet for doing it, you know what they did? They denied it. They denied they were doing actual idolatry until God's wrath fell upon them. These Hebrews thought that what they were doing may have been almost idolatry, maybe right up to the line, hey, you know, my heart's in the right place. God labeled it as idolatry, and he eventually killed thousands of Israelites for it, and he exiled the rest of them from the Holy Lands. We'll end here and finish up chapter 22 next week.